What dread lies beneath the stone where even the wise falter? In the deep places of the world where light is but a memory, what shadow waits to claim the heart? These are not questions for those who walk only in the sun, whose feet tread lightly on the grass of spring. They are questions for those who have heard the silence of the earth, who have felt the weight of unseen eyes, who have stood at the edge of the abyss and felt their soul tremble. They are questions for Gandalf the Grey, who paused at the gates of Moria, his staff a frail spark in the twilight, and felt a tremor not of the body, but of the spirit. Long before the sun and moon were kindled, before the stars sang their first song, there was a darkness that was not mere absence of light. It was a presence, a will, a hunger. Ilúvatar the One wove the world from a single note, a chord of boundless love that echoed through the void. But even in that harmony there were dissonant strains. Melkor, greatest of the Ainur, sang his own song, proud and defiant, and from his discord came the seeds of shadow. The world was born in beauty, its mountains raised, its rivers set to sing, but it was not unmarred. In the deep places where the roots of the earth drink from forgotten springs, that shadow lingers, still patient, eternal waiting. Gandalf knew this. He who was Aloran in the west, who walked among the Valar in the undying lands of Aman, had seen the light of the two trees, their silver and gold, a radiance that burned the heart with joy. He had heard the music of the Ainur, the song that shaped the seas and stars, yet he also knew its fractures, the notes that clashed, the silences that followed. The darkness he sensed at the gates of Moria was not new to him. It was ancient, older than the mountains themselves, a remnant of Melkor's malice that had seeped into the bones of the world, into the stone, into the silence. It was a darkness that whispered not in words, but in memories of a time when the world was young and its wounds were fresh. What is it to stand before such a shadow, to know that beyond the gate lies not just danger, but a question, one that pierces the soul and demands an answer? Gandalf, cloaked in grey, his face lined with the cares of ages, was no stranger to questions. He was a wanderer, a spark in the twilight sent by the Valar to kindle courage in the hearts of the weary. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the choice to move forward when fear whispers, "Turn back." And in that moment, as the Fellowship stood before the doors of Durin, their breath misting in the cold air, the whisper was loud, a chorus of doubts that stirred the heart. The gates of Moria were not merely stone. They were a threshold, a boundary between the world of light and the world below. To cross them was to leave behind the stars, the wind, the open sky, and to enter a place where time itself seemed to pause, where the air was heavy with the weight of things lost. The dwarves had delved deep their hammers, singing songs of craft and glory, carving halls that rivaled the palaces of the elves. But they had delved too greedily, too deep, driven by a hunger for Mithril the Silver that gleamed like starlight. In their hunger they had awakened something that should have remained asleep, something that now waited in the dark. Gandalf, who bore the wisdom of ages, felt the weight of that awakening. He knew the tales of Khazad-dûm, the great city of the dwarves, once a beacon of light in the heart of the mountains. He knew of Durin's folk, their pride, their skill, their fall. He knew that Moria was no longer a home, but a tomb, its halls filled with the echoes of a glory that had crumbled into dust. And yet he led the Fellowship toward its gates, for there was no other path. The ring borne by Frodo could not be carried openly across the mountains, not with Sauron's eyes watching his servants hunting. Moria was a necessity, but it was also a trial, a descent into the heart of the earth and the heart of the self. What is dread, if not the shadow of what we cannot name? For the hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, Moria was a place of fear, but their fear was young, born of the unknown. They were children of the Shire of green fields and gentle rivers, unaccustomed to the weight of ancient sorrow. Their eyes darted to the shadows, their hands clutched at cloaks, their hearts beat with the simple terror of the dark. For Aragorn and Legolas, Moria was a place of caution, a test of blade and bow, of vigilance, honed by years of wandering and war. For Gimli it was a place of longing, a dream of reclaiming the halls of his kin, of walking where his fathers had walked, of seeing the mithril veins gleam once more. But for Gandalf it was something more. It was a mirror reflecting not just the present but the past, not just the future but the eternal. To enter Moria was to walk into a story already half told. The pages were written in stone, in the bones of the fallen, in the dust that clung to the air. The dwarves had sought wealth, but they had found death. They had sought light, but they stepped into shadow. And Gandalf, who had counseled kings and comforted the broken, knew that the story was not yet finished. The Balrog, a creature of fire and shadow, a servant of Melkor from the days when the world was young, waited in the depths. Gandalf knew of such creatures. He had seen the fires of Utumno, the first stronghold of the enemy, where Melkor had forged his terrors. He knew that the Balrog was not merely a monster, but a remnant of a war that had never truly ended, a fragment of the discord that had marred the world's beginning. What does it mean to face such a foe, not with sword or spear, but with the soul? Gandalf was no warrior in the way of men. His strength was not in his arm, but in his will, his wisdom, his light. He was a Maya, a spirit of fire sent to guide, not to rule. Yet even light casts a shadow, and even the wise carry doubts. As he spoke the word to open the doors of Durin Melonfriend, the simplicity of the password belied the complexity of what lay beyond. Friendship could open the gate, but it could not shield the heart from the dread that waited within. The doors swung wide, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the light of the stars. The fellowship stepped into the dark, their footsteps echoing like ripples in a still pool. The hobbits clung to one another, their small forms dwarfed by the vastness of the halls. Frodo's hand strayed to the ring, its weight a constant reminder of his burden. Sam's eyes were wide, but his loyalty held him steady. Merry and Pippin whispered to each other, their voices frail against the silence. Aragorn's hand rested on the hilt of Andúril, his gaze scanning the shadows for threats. Legolas, ever watchful, moved with the grace of one who had never known fear, his elven senses attuned to the unseen. Gimli spoke of the glory of Khazad-dûm, his voice a mix of pride and hope, though it faltered as the darkness pressed closer. But Gandalf walked in silence, his staff a faint glow in the gloom, his heart a storm of light and shadow. What did he see in that darkness? What did he hear in the silence? The silence of Moria was not empty. It was a presence as tangible as the stone beneath their feet. It was the silence of a city that had once rung with life, with the clang of hammers, the laughter of feasts, the songs of craft. Now it was reduced to whispers, to the faint drip of water, to the sigh of air moving through forgotten halls. For Gandalf it was a silence that spoke. It spoke of the fragility of all things made, of the fleeting nature of glory, of the cost of hubris. The dwarves had built a kingdom to rival the stars, but they had forgotten the warning woven into the world's first song: all that is built must one day fall. What is it to carry such knowledge? To know that the world is marred, that its beauty is fleeting, that its light is ever threatened by shadow. Gandalf did not know the full tale of Moria, but he knew enough. He knew that the Balrog was not the only danger. He knew that the ring hanging heavy around Frodo's neck was a beacon, a flame that drew the eyes of Sauron, the enemy who had learned his malice at Melkor's knee. He knew that the Fellowship was not merely a company of travelers, but a thread in the tapestry of fate, a fragile hope woven into a world unraveling at its seams. To lead them into Moria was to lead them into the heart of a question: can the light endure where the shadow reigns? The hobbits, small and untested, were the heart of the Fellowship, but they were not its strength. That burden fell to Gandalf, to Aragorn, to those who had seen the world's sorrow and chosen to stand against it. Frodo carried the ring, but Gandalf carried the weight of its meaning. He knew what it was: a fragment of Sauron's will, a temptation that could corrupt even the purest heart. He knew that Frodo's burden was not just physical, but spiritual, a test of the soul that few could endure. And he knew that his own role was to guide, to protect, to light the way, even when the path led into darkness. Yet even Gandalf, who had counseled the wise and kindled hope in the despairing, felt the weight of that question. In the dark of Moria there were no stars to guide him, no wind to carry his thoughts. There was only the stone cold and unyielding, and the silence heavy with the memory of loss. The Fellowship moved deeper into the mines, their path lit only by the faint glow of Gandalf's staff. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker. The hobbits' fear was a living thing, a weight that slowed their steps. Aragorn and Legolas kept their vigil, their senses sharp, their resolve unbroken. Gimli's hope began to waver, his dreams of Khazad-dûm crumbling like the stone around them. But Gandalf pressed on his face, unreadable, his heart a battlefield of light and doubt. What dread did he face? It was not merely the Balrog, though, that was dread enough. A creature of fire and shadow, a relic of a war that had shaped the world. It was the knowledge that the world hung in the balance, that the ring could not be hidden forever, that the light he carried might not be enough. It was the fear that his wisdom, his will, his very being might falter when the moment came. For Gandalf was not a god, not a king, not a hero in the tales of men. He was a servant, a guide, a flame sent to burn against the dark. And in Moria that flame flickered not because it was weak, but because the dark was vast. The silence grew heavier as they descended, the shadows deeper. The walls of Moria seemed to close in their ancient carvings, a reminder of a glory long lost. The air was thick with the scent of stone and decay, a reminder that even the greatest works of hands could not withstand the weight of time. Gandalf's staff cast its light, but it was a frail thing, a candle in a storm. The whisper of the dark was louder now, a voice that spoke not in words, but in memories, in doubts, in the echoes of a world unmade. It spoke of Melkor's rebellion, of the fall of Utumno, of the wars that had scarred the earth. It spoke of the dwarves' greed, of their pride, of their fall. And it spoke to Gandalf not as Olorin, not as Mithrandir, but as a soul standing at the edge of the abyss. What is dread, if not the knowledge that the battle is never won? Gandalf had faced shadow before Sauron's servants, the Nazgûl, the lies that twisted men's hearts. He had walked through fire and storm, through despair and betrayal, but Moria was different. It was not a place of conquest, but of confrontation. It was a place where the soul was laid bare, where the light within was tested against the dark without. For Gandalf, who was both spirit and wanderer, both fire and guide, Moria was a crucible. It was a place where he would face not just the Balrog, but himself, the doubts he carried, the fears he hid, the questions he could not answer. The Fellowship pressed on their footsteps, a faint rhythm in the vastness of the halls. The hobbit's fear was a quiet thing, now subdued by exhaustion, by the weight of the dark. Aragorn and Legolas moved with purpose, their eyes ever watchful. Gimli's voice was silent, his dreams buried beneath the reality of Moria's ruin. But Gandalf walked at the fore, his staff a beacon, his heart a storm. He did not speak, for what words could pierce the silence? He did not falter, for what choice did he have? He was the light, the guide, the one who must go on, even when the dread was a weight he could scarcely bear. And yet he went on, for that is the truth of the wise. They do not conquer fear. They carry it step by step into the dark. They bear it not because they are strong, but because they must. Gandalf, who had seen the light of the two trees, who had heard the music of Ilúvatar, felt the dread of Moria as a living thing, a shadow that clung to his soul. But he also felt the light within him, the spark that had been kindled in the west, the flame that could not be extinguished. And so he walked deeper into the mines, deeper into the silence, deeper into the question that burned brighter than any flame. What does it mean to be the light when the darkness is all you see? What does it mean to carry a light that others cannot see? to bear a burden not chosen but given, a weight that presses not on the shoulders but on the soul. In the dark of Moria, where the stone drank the light, and the air was thick with the dust of ages, Gandalf the Grey walked with a flame within him, unseen by his companions, yet heavy as the mountains above. The wise do not choose their burdens choose them. And in the silence of those ancient halls, Gandalf felt the full measure of his task. Not as a hero, not as a conqueror, but as a servant of a song older than the stars. The Fellowship had crossed the threshold of Moria, leaving behind the starlit world, and stepping into a place where time seemed to hold its breath. The doors of Durin had yielded to the word melon, but the ease of that opening was a fleeting grace. Beyond the gates lay a labyrinth of stone, a city carved from the heart of the earth, now a mausoleum of dreams. The hobbits Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin moved with hesitant steps, their small forms dwarfed by the towering pillars. Aragorn's hand rested on his sword, his eyes piercing the gloom. Legolas, silent and alert, seemed to hear whispers in the stone that others could not. Gimli's voice, once eager with tales of Khazad-dûm's glory, had fallen quiet, his hope dimmed by the weight of a ruin, and Gandalf led them, his staff a faint beacon, his heart a crucible of light and shadow. What is a burden, if not the knowledge that others depend on you? Gandalf, who was Olorin in the west, who had walked among the Valar and seen the light of the two trees, bore a weight heavier than stone. It was not the weight of a crown nor the chain of a prisoner, but the weight of purpose. He was sent to Middle-earth not to rule, but to guide, to kindle hope where despair had taken root. Yet hope is a fragile thing, easily smothered by the dark. In Moria, that dark was not merely the absence of light, but a presence, a legacy of greed and pride that had brought low the mightiest of the dwarves. The halls of Moria were vast, their ceilings lost in shadow, their walls etched with the memory of a people who had loved the deep places. The dwarves had carved their dreams into the stone, their hammers singing of mithril and gold, of a kingdom that would endure beyond the count of years. But dreams, like stone, can crack. They had delved too deep, stirred something ancient, something that burned with the fire of the world's first wars. The Balrog, a demon of fire and shadow, a servant of Melkor, was no mere beast. It was a remnant of the discord that had marred the music of Ilúvatar, a wound in the world that had never healed. Gandalf knew this, and the knowledge was a burden he could not share. To lead the Fellowship into Moria was to lead them into a place where the past and present collided, where the echoes of old sins mingled with the fears of the now. Frodo bore the ring, its weight a constant torment, a whisper of power that gnawed at his heart. Sam, ever faithful, carried the burden of loyalty, his eyes never straying from his master. Merry and Pippin, young and untested, bore the weight of their own courage, a bravery born not of wisdom but of love. Aragorn carried the legacy of his fathers, the hope of a throne unclaimed. Legolas bore the sorrow of his kind, the knowledge that the elves were fading, their time in Middle-earth drawing to a close. Gimli carried the pride of his people, the dream of a home restored. But Gandalf carried them all, their hopes, their fears, their fates woven into the thread of his own purpose. What is it to bear such a burden, to know that every step could lead to ruin, that every choice could tip the balance of the world? Gandalf was no stranger to choice. He had walked the paths of Middle-earth for centuries, counseling the wise, comforting the broken, stirring the hearts of the weary. He had faced Sauron's servants, the Nazgûl, whose screams chilled the soul. He had seen the lies that twisted men's hearts, the greed that toppled kingdoms. Yet Moria was different. It was a place where the weight of the past was as heavy as the stone, where the future hung on a thread, where the present was a knife's edge between light and shadow. The Fellowship moved deeper into the mines, their footsteps a faint rhythm against the silence. The air was cold, thick with the scent of stone and decay. The light of Gandalf's staff cast long shadows flickering over carvings that told of a time when Khazad-dûm was alive with song. But now the halls were empty, save for the ghosts of memory. The hobbit's fear was a quiet thing subdued by the vastness of the dark. Frodo's hand strayed to the ring, its presence a constant weight, a temptation that whispered of escape, of power, of rest. Sam watched him, his heart heavy with unspoken vows. Merry and Pippin clung to each other, their whispers a frail defiance against the gloom. Aragorn and Legolas moved with purpose, their senses sharp, their resolve a shield against the unknown. Gimli's steps were heavy, his eyes searching for signs of his kin, his heart torn between hope and dread. But Gandalf walked at the fore, his staff a spark in the dark, his mind a storm of thought. What did he see in the shadows? What did he hear in the silence? The silence of Moria was not merely the absence of sound. It was a weight, a presence, a memory of all that had been lost. It was the silence of a people who had dared to rival the stars, who had built a city to endure forever, only to see it fall. It was the silence of graves, of dreams unfulfilled, of songs unsung. For Gandalf, it was a silence that spoke of the fragility of all things made, of the fleeting nature of glory, of the cost of reaching too far. What is a burden, if not the knowledge that you cannot save? All Gandalf knew the tales of Moria, the pride of Durin's folk, the greed that had led them to their doom. He knew of the Balrog, a creature born in the fires of the world's beginning, a shadow that had no place in the light of the present. He knew that the ring borne by Frodo was a danger greater than any demon, a temptation that could unmake the world. And he knew that his task was to guide the Fellowship through this darkness, to keep them whole, to keep them true, even when the path led to places where hope seemed a distant memory. The ring was a burden unlike any other. It was not merely a thing of gold, but a fragment of Sauron's will, a malice that sought to bend all to its purpose. Frodo carried it, but Gandalf felt its weight in every step. He saw it in Frodo's eyes, the shadow that grew with each passing day, the weariness that no rest could cure. He saw it in the way Frodo's hand lingered near the chain, as if drawn by a force he could not name. Gandalf knew the ring's power, its promise of strength, of victory, of dominion. He knew, too, its lie, that power could heal, that strength could save, that dominion could bring peace. He had seen the ring's work before in the hearts of men, in the fall of Númenor, in the pride of those who thought they could wield it and remain untouched. What is temptation, if not the whisper that you are enough? Gandalf was wise, but he was not immune. In the dark of Moria, where the stone seemed to press closer with every step, the ring's whisper was loud. Not to him directly Frodo bore that burden, but to the part of him that longed to see the world made whole. He was Olorin, a Maya, a spirit of fire and light, yet he walked in the guise of an old man, frail and mortal, bound by the limits of his task. He could not take the ring, could not wield it, for to do so would be to betray the very light he served. Yet the thought lingered a shadow at the edge of his mind. What if? What if the power were his? What if he could end the war, heal the world, banish the dark? The silence of Moria amplified that whisper. It was a place where doubts grew like moss on stone, where the weight of the past made the future seem frail. Gandalf felt the eyes of the Fellowship upon him, their trust a burden heavier than any ring. Frodo looked to him for guidance, his eyes haunted but resolute. Sam's loyalty was a quiet strength, a reminder of what was at stake. Merry and Pippin, so young, so small, carried a courage that shamed the wise. Aragorn, heir of kings, bore a legacy that could either save or doom. Legolas, eternal yet fading, carried the sorrow of his kind. Gimli, son of Durin, carried the hope of a people lost. And Gandalf carried them all, their fears, their hopes, their fates woven into the thread of his own purpose. What is it to lead when the path is dark, to guide when the way is lost? Gandalf had no map for Moria, no star to steer by. The mines were a maze, their paths twisted by time and ruin. The carvings on the walls, once proud, were now faded, their stories half forgotten. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. Yet Gandalf pressed on his staff, a faint glow, his will a flame that refused to falter. He knew the danger that waited, not just the Balrog, but the ring, the shadow it cast, the temptation it offered. He knew that Moria was a crucible, a place where the soul was tested, where the light within was weighed against the dark without. The Fellowship came upon a chamber vast and silent, its ceiling lost in shadow. The stone was scarred, the air thick with the memory of battle. Here the dwarves had made their stand, their axes raised against the dark. Here they had fallen, their bones scattered like leaves. Gimli's breath caught his eyes, gleaming with unshed tears. The hobbits drew closer, their fear a tangible thing. Aragorn's face was grim, his hand tight on his sword. Legolas stood still, his gaze distant as if hearing the echoes of a song long ended. But Gandalf paused, his staff casting a pale light over a stone tomb. It was Balin's tomb, a marker of hope turned to dust. What is legacy, if not the shadow of what we leave behind? Balin, son of Fundin, had come to Moria with dreams of restoration, of reclaiming the halls of his fathers. He had brought his kin, their hearts alight with hope, their hands ready to rebuild. But Moria was no place for dreams. The stone had closed around them, the dark had claimed them. Balin's tomb was a warning, a reminder that even the noblest intentions could lead to ruin. Gandalf read the runes, his voice steady but heavy. Balin, son of Fundin, lord of Moria. The words hung in the air, a requiem for a dream. The hobbits wept, their small voices breaking the silence. Gimli's shoulders shook, his pride shattered. Aragorn and Legolas stood silent, their faces carved with sorrow. But Gandalf felt the weight of Balin's fall as a wound, a reminder of his own task. He had known Balin had shared his fire, his laughter, his hope. Now Balin was gone, his dream buried beneath the stone. What did it mean to lead when those you led could fall? What did it mean to hope when hope could end in dust? The silence returned heavier, now laced with the memory of loss. Gandalf turned from the tomb, his staff raised his voice, calling the Fellowship to move on. But the weight of Balin's fall lingered, a burden added to the many he carried. The ring, the Balrog, the Fellowship, the world all rested on his shoulders, a weight that grew with every step. Yet he did not falter, for to falter was to fail, and failure was a shadow he could not bear. The Fellowship pressed deeper into Moria, the dark closing around them like a fist. The stone was cold, the air heavy with the scent of death. The light of Gandalf's staff flickered, a frail thing against the vastness of the mines. The hobbits' fear was a quiet hum, their steps slow but steady. Aragorn and Legolas watched the shadows, their hands ready. Gimli walked with head bowed, his dreams buried with Balin. But Gandalf led them, his heart a storm of light and doubt, his will a flame that burned against the dark. What is a burden, if not the knowledge that you must go on? Gandalf felt the dread of Moria as a living thing, a shadow that clung to his soul. He felt the weight of the ring, the temptation it offered, the danger it posed. He felt the weight of the Fellowship, their trust, their hope, their fear. He felt the weight of the world, its beauty, its sorrow, its fragility. And he felt the weight of himself, a Loren Mithrandir, a servant sent to light the way, even when the way was lost. In the dark of Moria, where the stone whispered of ruin and the silence spoke of loss, Gandalf carried his burden step by step into the heart of the shadow. What is temptation, if not the whisper that you could be more? In the heart of Moria, where the stone was cold and the darkness a living thing, Gandalf the Grey walked with a light that flickered not from want of strength, but from the weight of a question. What if the flame within could burn brighter, could banish the shadow, could remake the world? The wise are not immune to such whispers. They hear them clearest in the silence where the soul stands alone, stripped of all but its own truth. And in Moria the silence was a mirror reflecting not just the dread of what lay ahead, but the dread of what lay within. The fellowship had descended deeper into the mines, their path a winding thread through a labyrinth of stone. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay, the memory of a kingdom lost. The light of Gandalf's staff cast frail shadows dancing over walls, carved with the pride of Durin's folk. The hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin moved with weary steps, their fear a quiet hum beneath their courage. Aragorn's eyes scanned the gloom, his hand steady on his sword. Legolas, ever vigilant, seemed to hear the stone itself whisper secrets of the past. Gimli, his heart heavy with Balin's fall, walked with the weight of a dream shattered. But Gandalf led them, his staff a spark in the dark, his soul a battlefield where light and shadow clashed. What does it mean to be a light in a place where darkness reigns? Gandalf, who was Oloran in the west, a Maya of fire and wisdom, had been sent to Middle-earth, not to conquer but to kindle. His task was to guide, to stir the hearts of the weary, to hold fast against the shadow of Sauron. Yet in Moria that task felt frail, a candle flame against a storm. The mines were not merely a place of stone and shadow. They were a crucible, a forge where the soul was tested, where the light within was weighed against the dark without. And for Gandalf the test was not just the Balrog that waited in the depths, but the temptation that burned within him, a flame as fierce as any demon's fire. The ring was the heart of that temptation. It hung around Frodo's neck, a small thing of gold, yet heavier than the mountains above. It was no mere trinket, but a fragment of Sauron's will, a malice that sought to bend all to its purpose. Frodo bore it, his face pale, his eyes haunted by a burden that grew with every step. Sam watched him, his loyalty a quiet strength, his heart aching with unspoken vows. Merry and Pippin, young and untested, clung to their courage, their small forms a defiance against the dark. But Gandalf felt the ring's presence as a weight, a whisper, a question that pierced the silence. What could you do with such power? The ring was not silent. It spoke not in words, but in desires, in promises, in lies. To Frodo it whispered of escape, of rest, of a world where he could be free. To Aragorn it spoke of a throne reclaimed, a kingdom restored. To Gimli it offered the glory of Khazad-dûm reborn. To Legolas it promised a world where the elves need not fade. And to Gandalf it sang a song of light, a world made whole, a shadow banished, a harmony restored. But Gandalf knew the lie within that song. He had seen the fall of Númenor, the pride of men who thought they could wield power and remain untouched. He had seen the work of Sauron, the pupil of Melkor, whose malice had marred the world. The ring was no tool for good. It was a chain, a trap, a shadow that devoured the light it promised. What is it to resist such a whisper? To stand in the dark with the weight of the world upon you and say, I will not. Gandalf was wise, but he was not beyond temptation. He was a Maya, a spirit of fire, yet he walked in the guise of an old man bound by the limits of his task. He could not take the ring, could not wield it, for to do so would be to betray the light he served. Yet in the silence of Moria, where the stone seemed to press closer with every step, the ring's whisper was loud. It spoke to the part of him that longed to see the world healed, to end the war, to banish the dark. It spoke to the flame within him, the fire that had burned in the west, the light that had shone before the world was made. The fellowship came upon a fork in the path, 3 tunnels branching into the dark. The stone was smooth, the air still, yet the choice was heavy. Gandalf paused, his staff raised, his eyes searching the shadows. The hobbits waited, their breath misting in the cold. Aragorn stood ready, his face carved with resolve. Legolas listened, his senses attuned to the unseen. Gimli's hand rested on his axe, his heart torn between hope and grief. But Gandalf stood silent, his mind a storm of thought. Which path to take, which way to safety? The minds were a maze, their secrets buried in time. Yet the choice was more than a matter of direction. It was a test, a moment where the soul was laid bare. What is faith, if not the choice to move forward when the path is unseen? Gandalf had no map, no star to guide him. The light of his staff was frail, a spark against the vastness of Moria. Yet he stood, his heart wrestling with the silence, with the whisper of the ring, with the dread of what lay ahead. He knew the Balrog waited, a shadow of fire that had no place in the light of the present. He knew the ring was a danger greater than any demon, a temptation that could unmake the world. And he knew that his task was to lead, to guide, to light the way, even when the way was lost. The silence of Moria was a weight, a presence that pressed against the soul. It was the silence of a city that had once rung with life, with the clang of hammers, the songs of craft, the laughter of feasts. Now it was a tomb, its halls filled with the dust of dreams. The stone bore the marks of the dwarves' pride, their greed, their fall. The air carried the memory of their voices, now faded to whispers. For Gandalf, the silence was a mirror reflecting the fragility of all things, made the cost of reaching too far, the shadow that lingered in the heart of every light. What is it to be tempted by your own flame? Gandalf was a spirit of fire, a Maya sent to kindle hope, yet in Moria that fire was tested. The ring's whisper was not the only temptation. There was another subtler, born of his own nature. He was Olorin, a being of light, yet he walked as Gandalf, cloaked in grey, bound by the frailty of flesh. The fire within him longed to burn brighter, to cast aside the limits of his task, to meet the shadow with a flame that could rival the sun. But such a flame would consume, not heal. It would destroy, not guide. To give in to that temptation would be to become what he fought against, a shadow cloaked in light, a power that bent the world to its will. The Fellowship waited, their eyes on Gandalf, their trust a burden heavier than stone. Frodo's face was pale, the ring a constant weight, its whisper a torment he could not escape. Sam's loyalty was a quiet strength, his eyes never straying from his master. Merry and Pippin, small and weary, clung to their courage, their voices silent but their hearts resolute. Aragorn, heir of kings, bore a legacy that could either save or doom. Legolas, eternal yet fading, carried the sorrow of his kind. Gimli, son of Durin, carried the grief of a people lost. And Gandalf carried them all, their hopes, their fears, their fates woven into the thread of his own purpose. What is it to lead when the heart is divided, to guide when the soul is tempted? Gandalf stood at the fork, the three paths stretching into the dark. The stone was cold, the air heavy with the memory of ruin. The light of his staff flickered, a frail thing against the vastness of the mines. Yet he closed his eyes, his heart seeking the silence, not the whisper of the ring, but the deeper song, the echo of the music of Ilúvatar that had shaped the world. He sought the light within the flame that had burned in the west, the purpose that had brought him to this place. And in that silence he found his answer. "I have no memory of this place," he said, his voice a quiet thunder in the dark. "But come, let us go on." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of faith, the choice to move forward when the path was unseen. The Fellowship followed their steps, a faint rhythm against the stone. The hobbit's fear was a quiet thing, subdued by trust. Aragorn and Legolas moved with purpose, their senses sharp. Gimli's steps were heavy, his heart still with Balin's tomb. But Gandalf led them, his staff, a spark, his will, a flame that refused to falter. The path wound deeper, the stone closing around them like a fist. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker. The silence was oppressive, laced with the memory of loss. Yet Gandalf felt another presence, a heat that was not of the stone, a fire that was not his own. The Balrog was near its shadow, a weight in the dark, its flame a challenge to the light he carried. He knew it was no mere beast, but a relic of the world's first wars, a servant of Melkor, whose fire had burned before the sun was kindled. To face it would be to face not just a foe, but a mirror, a reflection of the fire within him, the temptation to burn too brightly, to cast aside the limits of his task. What is faith, if not the choice to hold fast to the light, even when the flame tempts you to consume? Gandalf knew the Balrog was a test not just of strength, but of purpose. He knew the ring was a test not just of Frodo, but of them all. And he knew that Moria was a crucible, a place where the soul was forged, where the light was weighed against the dark. The temptation of the ring was a whisper of power, but the temptation of the flame was a whisper of self, a call to cast aside the grey cloak, to burn as Olorin, to meet fire with fire. Yet such a choice would be a betrayal not of the Fellowship, but of the light itself. The Fellowship came upon a chamber vast and silent, its pillars rising like trees into the dark. The stone was scarred, the air thick with the memory of battle. Here the dwarves had fought, their axes raised against the shadow. Here they had fallen, their bones scattered like dust. The light of Gandalf's staff fell upon a book, its pages brittle, its words a requiem for a people lost. The Book of Mazarbul, written by Balin's hand, told of hope turned to despair, of a dream buried beneath the stone. Gandalf read aloud, his voice steady but heavy, the words a weight upon his heart. We cannot get out. They are coming. The hobbits wept, their small voices breaking the silence. Gimli's shoulders shook his grief. A wound reopened. Aragorn's face was grim, his hand tight on his sword. Legolas stood still, his gaze distant, as if hearing the echoes of a song long ended. But Gandalf felt the words as a warning, a reminder of the cost of temptation, of the shadow that waited for those who reached too far. The dwarves had sought Mithril, but they had found death. They had sought glory, but they had found ruin. And Gandalf, who carried the light, knew that his own temptation was no less perilous. What is it to resist when the heart longs to yield? The ring's whisper was loud, the Balrog's presence a heat in the dark. Yet Gandalf stood, his staff raised, his heart wrestling with the silence. He felt the weight of the Fellowship, their trust, their hope, their fear. He felt the weight of the ring, its malice, its lie. He felt the weight of the Balrog, its fire, its challenge. And he felt the weight of himself, Olorin Mithrandir, a servant sent to guide, to light the way, even when the way was lost. In that moment he chose not the flame that consumed, but the flame that guided, the light that endured. The silence broke with a sound, a distant drum in the deep. Boom, boom. The stone trembled, the air grew hot. The hobbits froze, their fear a living thing. Aragorn and Legolas drew their weapons, their eyes scanning the dark. Gimli gripped his axe, his grief turning to resolve. But Gandalf stood still, his staff a spark, his heart a storm. The Balrog was coming, its fire a shadow in the deep, its presence a challenge to the light he carried. Yet the temptation was not the Balrog alone, but the fire within, the whisper that he could burn brighter, that he could be more, that he could end the dark. What is faith, if not the choice to be the light, even when the shadow is all you see? Gandalf turned to the Fellowship, his voice a quiet command. We must move on. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of purpose, the choice to resist, to endure, to guide. The Fellowship followed their steps, quickening their hearts, heavy with the drum's echo. The stone was cold, the air thick with dread. But Gandalf led them, his staff a beacon, his will a flame that burned against the dark, a light that refused to yield to the temptation of the flame. What does it mean to stand when all else falls? To hold the light when the shadow surges, to be the flame when the fire seeks to consume? In the heart of Moria, where the stone trembled and the air burned, Gandalf the Grey faced not just a foe, but a truth that cuts deeper than any blade, that burns brighter than any flame. The wise do not seek sacrifice, it finds them. And in the abyss, where the world's oldest wounds bled anew, Gandalf stood, his staff a spark, his soul a beacon, knowing that some battles are fought not to win, but to endure. The drumbeat had broken the silence. Boom, boom, it echoed through the mines, a pulse in the stone, a summons from the deep. The fellowship ran their footsteps, a frantic rhythm against the dark. The hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, stumbled, their fear a weight that clung to their hearts. Aragorn's sword was drawn, his eyes fierce with resolve. Legolas nocked an arrow, his movements swift, his gaze piercing the gloom. Gimli gripped his axe, his grief forged into defiance. But Gandalf led them, his staff, a frail glow, his heart a storm of light and dread. The Balrog was coming, its fire a shadow in the deep, its presence a challenge to the flame he carried. What is sacrifice, if not the choice to give what you cannot keep? Gandalf, who was Olorin in the west, a Maya of fire and wisdom, had walked the paths of Middle-earth for centuries, kindling hope in the hearts of the weary. He had faced shadow before Sauron's servants, the Nazgul, the lies that twisted men's souls. But the Balrog was different. It was no mere creature, but a relic of the world's first wars, a servant of Melkor whose fire had burned before the sun was kindled. It was a mirror reflecting the flame within him, the light he bore, the dread he carried. To face it was to face not just death, but the cost of being the light. The fellowship fled through halls of stone, their breath ragged, their steps echoing in the vastness of Moria. The air grew hot, the shadows thick with menace. The drumbeat grew louder, a thunder in the deep, matched by the roar of fire. The hobbits' fear was a living thing, their small forms trembling but resolute. Frodo clutched the ring, its weight a torment, its whisper drowned by the terror of the moment. Sam stayed close, his loyalty a shield against the dark. Merry and Pippin ran, their courage a spark in the gloom. Aragorn and Legolas guarded the rear, their weapons ready, their hearts steeled. Gimli's axe gleamed, his voice a growl of defiance. But Gandalf felt the heat of the Balrog, its fire a presence that pressed against his soul. What is it to face the abyss, to stand at the edge of the world and know that the fall is yours alone? The mines of Moria were no mere tunnels. They were a wound in the earth, a scar left by the dwarves' greed, a place where the shadow of Melkor lingered. The stone was scarred, the air heavy with the memory of ruin. The light of Gandalf's staff flickered, a frail thing against the fire that approached. Yet he led the fellowship, his voice a quiet command, urging them toward the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the narrow span that promised escape. But escape was a hope, not a certainty, and Gandalf knew the truth: the Balrog would not let them pass unchallenged. The fellowship reached the bridge, a slender arc of stone over a chasm that fell into darkness. The air was thick with heat, the stone trembling with the Balrog's approach. The drumbeat was a roar now, matched by the crackle of fire. The hobbits froze, their eyes wide with terror. Aragorn and Legolas turned, their weapons raised, their faces grim. Gimli stood ready, his axe a defiance against the shadow. But Gandalf stopped, his staff raised, his heart a crucible where light and dread collided. The Balrog was here, its fire filling the hall, its shadow a weight that crushed the air. What is a foe, if not a mirror of the self? The Balrog was no mere demon, but a Maya like Gandalf, a spirit of fire twisted by Melkor's malice. Its flame was not the light of creation, but the fire of destruction, a shadow that burned with the discord of the world's beginning. Gandalf saw it emerge, a figure of flame and shadow, its whip cracking like thunder, its sword a blade of fire. The hobbits cried out, their voices lost in the roar. Aragorn and Legolas stepped forward, their weapons drawn, but Gandalf raised his hand, his voice a command: you cannot pass. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of ages. They were not a challenge, but a truth, a line drawn in the stone. The Balrog paused, its fire flaring, its shadow deepening. The fellowship stood behind Gandalf, their breath held, their hearts pounding. Frodo's hand clutched the ring, its whisper silent now, overwhelmed by the terror of the moment. Sam's eyes were fixed on Gandalf, his loyalty a quiet prayer. Merry and Pippin clung to each other, their courage a frail spark. Aragorn and Legolas weighted, their weapons steady, their trust in Gandalf absolute. Gimli's axe was raised, his grief a fire that matched the Balrog's own. What is it to stand when the world trembles? Gandalf faced the Balrog, his staff a spark, his sword glamdring, gleaming in the firelight. He was no warrior in the way of men, but a servant of the light, a guide sent to kindle hope. Yet in that moment he was more a flame against the flame, a light against the shadow. The Balrog roared its whip, lashing its fire surging. Gandalf raised his staff, his voice a thunder that shook the stone. I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. The words were a song, a declaration, a defiance of the discord that had marred the world. The secret fire was the light of Ilúvatar, the flame of creation that burned in the heart of the world. The flame of Anor was the light of the sun, the hope of a new day. The Balrog was a flame of Udun, a fire of destruction born in Melkor's stronghold. Gandalf stood as a servant, not a master, his power not his own, but given his light, not for glory, but for guidance. The Balrog surged forward, its whip cracking, its sword slashing, and Gandalf met it, his staff a shield, his sword a spark. What is sacrifice, if not the choice to give all for those who cannot? The battle was no clash of blades, but a clash of wills, a confrontation of light and shadow. The stone cracked, the air burned, the chasm yawned below. The hobbits watched, their hearts breaking, their voices silent. Aragorn and Legolas stood ready, their weapons useless against such a foe. Gimli's axe trembled, his grief a weight that anchored him. But Gandalf fought, his light a flame that burned against the dark, his will a shield that held the shadow at bay. The Balrog's fire surged, its shadow deepened, but Gandalf did not falter, for to falter was to fail, and failure was a shadow he could not bear. The bridge trembled, the stone groaning under the weight of fire. Gandalf struck, his staff ablaze, his sword a streak of light. The Balrog roared its whip, lashing its fire, consuming the air. The Fellowship watched, their breath held, their hope a frail thing. Frodo's eyes were wide, the ring a weight he could not feel in that moment. Sam's heart ached, his loyalty a vow unspoken. Merry and Pippin wept, their courage a spark that refused to die. Aragorn and Legolas waited, their trust in Gandalf a light that burned through the dark. Gimli stood, his axe raised, his heart a fire that matched the battle before him. What is it to burn when the world is ash? Gandalf felt the Balrog's fire, its shadow, its malice. He felt the weight of the Fellowship, their trust, their hope, their fear. He felt the weight of the ring, its danger, its temptation. He felt the weight of the world, its beauty, its sorrow, its fragility. And he felt the weight of himself. Olorin Mithrandir, a servant sent to guide, to light the way, even when the way was lost. In that moment he knew the truth, the Balrog could not pass, but neither could he. The bridge was a threshold, a boundary between life and death, between light and shadow, between the world and the abyss. The Balrog struck its whip, lashing its fire surging. Gandalf met it, his staff ablaze, his will a flame that refused to yield. The stone cracked, the bridge shuddered, and with a final cry Gandalf struck the bridge with his staff. The stone shattered, the bridge fell, and the Balrog plummeted into the chasm, its fire a fading roar, but its whip lashed out, coiling around Gandalf's legs, and he was pulled to the edge. The hobbits cried out, their voices a plea. Aragorn and Legolas lunged forward, their hands outstretched. Gimli roared, his axe useless, but Gandalf clung to the stone, his eyes fixed on the Fellowship, his voice a quiet command. Fly, you fools. The words were a farewell, a command, a sacrifice. The Fellowship froze, their hearts breaking, their hope crumbling. Frodo's cry was a wound, Sam's tears a vow, Merry and Pippin's sobs a prayer. Aragorn's face was stone, his duty a weight he could not bear. Legolas's eyes were distant, his sorrow eternal. Gimli's axe fell, his grief a fire that burned without light. But Gandalf was gone, pulled into the abyss, his light a spark that faded into the dark. The Balrog's fire was quenched, but so was his own, and the fellowship stood alone, their guide lost their path uncertain. What is sacrifice, if not the giving of self for a world that may not endure? Gandalf fell, his body broken, his light dimmed, but his will unbroken. The abyss was no mere chasm, but a journey, a passage through the heart of the earth, through the heart of the self. He fought the Balrog, still their fire a clash of light and shadow, their wills a battle that shook the roots of the mountains. He fell through darkness, through fire, through time, until the world was a memory, and the light within him was all that remained. He was Olorin, a spirit of fire, and he burned not for himself, but for those he had left behind. The fellowship fled their footsteps, a frantic rhythm, their hearts heavy with loss. The stone was cold, the air thick with the memory of fire. Frodo ran the ring, a weight he could not escape, his heart torn by Gandalf's fall. Sam followed his loyalty, a light that refused to fade. Merry and Pippin clung to each other, their courage a spark in the dark. Aragorn led them his duty, a burden heavier than stone. Legolas ran his sorrow, a song unsung. Gimli followed his grief, a fire that burned without hope. The bridge was gone, the Balrog vanquished, but the cost was a wound that would not heal. What is it to lose the light and yet go on? The fellowship emerged from Moria, the sunlight a cruel reminder of what they had lost. The world was bright, but their hearts were dark, their hope a frail thing. Frodo stood, his eyes distant, the ring, a weight that grew with every step. Sam stayed close, his loyalty a vow that held him steady. Merry and Pippin wept their courage, a spark that refused to die. Aragorn took up the lead, his duty a fire that burned through his grief. Legolas looked to the sky, his sorrow a song that would not fade. Gimli stood, his axe heavy, his heart a ruin. But Gandalf's sacrifice was not the end. In the abyss he fought his light, a flame that burned against the dark. He fell through the heart of the earth, through fire and shadow, until he reached the peak of Zirak-Sigil, where the stars shone once more. There he slew the Balrog, its fire quenched, its shadow broken, but his own light was spent, his body broken, his task unfinished. He lay upon the stone, the world a distant dream, his heart a spark that refused to die. And in that moment he was called back, not by his own will, but by the will of Ilúvatar, the one who wove the world. What is sacrifice if not a light that burns beyond the dark? Gandalf's fall was a wound, but it was also a forging, a passage through the fire that made him more. He was Olorin, a spirit of fire, but he was also Mithrandir, a wanderer, a guide, a servant of the light. His sacrifice was not a defeat, but a defiance, a choice to stand when all else fell, to burn when the world was ash. The fellowship carried his loss, but they also carried his light, a spark that would kindle anew in the days to come. The stone of Moria was silent now, the drumbeat gone, the fire quenched. But the memory of Gandalf's stand lingered, a song that echoed in the heart of the world. He had faced the Balrog not as a warrior, but as a servant, his light a flame that burned for others. He had faced the abyss not as a god, but as a guide, his will a shield that held the shadow at bay. And he had fallen not as a failure, but as a sacrifice, a light that burned beyond the dark, a flame that would return to light the way once more. What does it mean to lose the light and yet find it again? To walk through the shadow, to fall into the abyss, and to rise, not as you were, but as you were meant to be. In the silence that followed Gandalf's fall, where the stone of Moria held its breath and the world seemed to pause, there was a truth older than the mountains. The light does not die. It fades, it flickers, it falls, but it endures, a spark in the dark, a song that lingers beyond the final note. And in that truth the dread of Moria became not an end, but a beginning, a revelation that burned brighter than any flame. The fellowship had fled the mines, their hearts heavy with loss, their steps faltering under the weight of grief. The sunlight that greeted them was a cruel jest, its warmth a mockery of the cold that clung to their souls. Frodo stood, his eyes distant, the ring, a chain that bound him to a purpose he could scarcely bear. Sam stayed close, his loyalty a quiet vow, his tears a testament to a love that refused to break. Merry and Pippin wept openly, their small forms trembling their courage, a spark that flickered but did not fade. Aragorn took up the lead, his duty a burden heavier than stone, his face carved with a sorrow he could not voice. Legolas looked to the sky, his elven heart singing a lament that no mortal could hear. Gimli walked with head bowed, his axe heavy, his grief a wound that bled with every step. Gandalf was gone, and the world was darker for it. What is loss, if not the silence where hope once sang? The fellowship stood on the slopes of Dimril Dale, the mountains rising around them, the stars faint above. The air was clean, the wind a whisper of freedom, but their hearts were tethered to the dark of Moria, to the bridge where Gandalf had stood, to the chasm that had claimed him. Frodo's cry still echoed in their ears, a wound that would not heal. Sam's tears were a prayer, Merry and Pippin's sobs a plea. Aragorn's resolve was a shield, Legolas's sorrow a song, Gimli's grief a fire. But the absence of Gandalf was a weight they could not name, a shadow that lingered in the light of day. Yet Gandalf was not gone. In the abyss, where the stone was cold and the dark was absolute, he had fought. He had fallen with the Balrog, their fire a clash of light and shadow, their wills a battle that shook the roots of the earth. Through darkness, through fire, through time, he had pursued his foe, his light a flame that refused to yield. On the peak of Xeroxagil, under the stars, he had slain the Balrog. Its fire quenched, its shadow broken. But his own light was spent, his body broken, his task unfinished. He lay upon the stone, the world a distant dream, his heart a spark that burned beyond the dark. And in that moment he was called back, not by his own will, but by the will of Ilúvatar, the one who wove the world. What is renewal, if not the light that returns changed? Yet true, Gandalf was no longer the gray, but the white, his cloak a radiance, his purpose refined in the fire of sacrifice. He was Olorin, a spirit of fire, but he was also Mithrandir, a wanderer, a guide, a servant of the light. His fall was a wound, but it was also a forging, a passage through the abyss that made him more. He returned not to conquer, but to continue to light the way where the shadow lingered, to guide those who carried the hope of the world. His return was a revelation, a truth that the light endures, even when the dark seems absolute. The fellowship did not know this. They walked on their path uncertain, their hearts heavy with loss. Frodo bore the ring, its weight a torment, its whisper a shadow that grew with every step. Sam followed his loyalty, a light that held him steady, his love a vow that would not break. Merry and Pippin clung to their courage, their small forms a defiance against despair. Aragorn led them, his duty a fire that burned through his grief, his hope a spark that refused to die. Legolas sang his sorrow, his voice a thread in the tapestry of the world. Gimli carried his grief, his axe a weight, his heart a ruin. They walked not knowing that the light they had lost would return, that the flame they mourned would burn again. What is hope, if not the echo of a light unseen? The fellowship's journey was not ended in Moria, though it felt so. The ring still hung around Frodo's neck, its malice a danger that could unmake the world. Sauron's eye watched his servants hunted, his shadow grew, yet the fellowship carried on their steps a defiance, their hearts a spark. They carried Gandalf's light, though they did not know it, the light of his courage, his sacrifice, his faith. They carried the memory of his stand, his words, his fall. And in that memory they found the strength to go on, to face the shadow, to bear the burden of the world. The stone of Moria was silent now, the drumbeat gone, the fire quenched, but its echoes lingered, a song that reverberated in the heart of the world. Moria was no mere mine, but a crucible, a place where the soul was tested, where the light was weighed against the dark. For Frodo, it was a place of burden, the ring a weight that grew heavier with every step. For Sam, it was a place of loyalty, his vow to Frodo, a light that burned through the dark. For Merry and Pippin, it was a place of courage, their small hearts a defiance against despair. For Aragorn, it was a place of duty, his legacy, a fire that burned through grief. For Legolas, it was a place of sorrow, his song, a lament for a world that was fading. For Gimli, it was a place of loss, his dreams buried with Balin, his heart, a wound that would not heal. But for Gandalf, Moria was a place of revelation. It was the abyss where he faced the dread of the Balrog, the temptation of the ring, the weight of his own flame. It was the bridge where he stood not as a warrior but as a servant, his light a flame that burned for others. It was the chasm where he fell, not as a failure but as a sacrifice, a light that burned beyond the dark. And it was the peak where he rose not as the gray, but as the white, his purpose refined, his light renewed. Moria was his crucible, his forging, his song, a song that echoed in the hearts of those he left behind, a light that lingered in the world he served. What is legacy if not the light that others carry? Gandalf's fall was a wound, but it was also a gift. He gave himself to the abyss not for glory, but for hope, for the chance that the fellowship might go on, that the ring might be destroyed, that the world might be saved. His sacrifice was a spark, a flame that kindled courage in the hearts of the weary. Frodo carried it, his burden heavier, but his resolve unbroken. Sam carried it, his loyalty a light that refused to fade. Merry and Pippin carried it, their courage, a spark that burned through despair. Aragorn carried it, his duty, a fire that burned through grief. Legolas carried it, his sorrow, a song that wove hope into the world. Gimli carried it, his grief, a wound that forged resolve. The world was not saved in Moria, but it was held. The shadow of Sauron grew, but the light of hope endured. The ring was not destroyed, but its bearer walked on. The fellowship was broken, but its heart remained a thread in the tapestry of fate, and Gandalf, though fallen, was not lost. His light returned not as a conqueror, but as a guide, a servant of the secret fire, a wanderer who lit the way. His return was a revelation, not of victory, but of endurance, of the truth, that the light does not die, that the song does not end, that the dread of the abyss is but a note in the music of the world. What is revelation, if not the seeing of the light in the dark? The fellowship walked on their path uncertain, their hearts heavy. They did not know that Gandalf would return, that the white would rise where the gray had fallen. They did not know that the light they mourned would burn again, brighter, purer, refined in the fire of sacrifice. Yet they carried that light in their steps, in their hearts, in their defiance of the shadow. They carried the echo of Gandalf's stand, his words, his fall, a song that lingered, a flame that burned beyond the dark. The stars shone above Dimrill Dale, their light a faint promise in the night. The wind whispered, the mountains stood, the world turned. Frodo walked the ring, a weight his heart, a storm of doubt and resolve. Sam followed his loyalty, a light, his love a vow. Merry and Pippin clung to their courage, their small forms a defiance. Aragorn led his duty, a fire, his hope a spark. Legolas sang his sorrow, a song, his heart eternal. Gimli walked his grief, a wound, his resolve a flame. They were the fellowship broken, but unbroken their light, a reflection of the one who had stood, who had fallen, who had burned for them. What is the dread of Moria, if not the dread of the soul? It is the fear of the dark, the weight of the burden, the whisper of temptation, the cost of sacrifice. It is the silence where hope falters, the fire that threatens to consume, the abyss that waits to claim. But it is also the light that endures, the courage that rises, the song that lingers. Gandalf faced that dread not as a god, but as a servant, his light a flame that burned for others. He stood, he fell, he rose, and in his journey he revealed a truth. The dread is not the end. It is the crucible, the forging, the song that shapes the soul. The echo of Moria lingers, not in the stone, but in the heart. It lingers in Frodo's burden, in Sam's loyalty, in Merry, and Pippin's courage, in Aragorn's duty, in Legolas's song, in Gimli's resolve. It lingers in the light that Gandalf carried, the flame that burned in the dark, the sacrifice that lit the way. It lingers in the world, in its beauty, its sorrow, its hope. For the dread of Moria is the dread of all who walk in shadow, who bear the weight, who face the fire. And the light of Moria is the light of all who endure, who rise, who sing. The song does not end. It fades, it falters, it falls, but it returns a note in the music of Ilúvatar, a spark in the dark of the world. Gandalf's light burns still, not in the stone of Moria, but in the hearts of those who carry on, in the steps of those who walk through shadow, in the hope that rises where despair would reign. What dread did Gandalf face in the depths of Moria? It was the dread of the soul, the weight of the light, the cost of the flame. But it was also the revelation of the light, the truth that the shadow is not eternal, that the song endures, that the echo of the light is a flame that never dies.